Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of London to this second New Zealand UK Link Foundation lecture. My name is Graeme Davies, and I have the privilege of being chairman of the Trust. The Trust was set up in 1991, essentially as a consequence of a decision that was made to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Wellcome. And a group of business people and others in this country raised quite a large amount of money to foster connections between New Zealand and the United Kingdom. And we are just celebrating our 25th anniversary. It has been an interesting journey. If you look back through the records, we have supported the movement between the two countries of young people and mature people, business people, singers, musicians, students, wine buffs, all of those things that New Zealand likes to think it's very good at. But we also decided, partly prompted by the importance of events in 1940 and thereafter to the perceptions of New Zealand, that we would start an annual lecture series. The first was given last year by Sir Hugh Strachan, who talked in a broad sense about New Zealand's role in the First War, and since 1915 was a very critical year, as most of you will know, for New Zealand and Australia, and the concept of ANZAC, it seemed highly appropriate on this occasion to follow up Hugh Strachan's lecture with this lecture by Jenny Macleod. But no lecture would be a valuable and enjoyable experience for the lecturer if it didn't have an informed and aware collection of guests, and clearly we have that from places that I recognise around the room from my many years in academia. So on behalf of the Foundation, can I thank you for your support. I have no doubt, as the Director of the Institute of Historical Research will tell you in a moment, that you will enjoy this. Thank you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Lawrence Goldman, and I'm the Director of the Institute of Historical Research. And we're delighted to be co-sponsors of this lecture tonight, which is of obvious interest to the Institute, but which also falls within a festival of the Humanities, which is currently going on here in the University of London, and indeed throughout the United Kingdom. It's called Being Human, and it's in fact the only national festival of the humanities in the UK, and it's organised and led from here in the University of London. The School of Advanced Study, of which the Institute is a part, organises it each autumn. And we're in partnership ourselves in the festival with the Arts and Humanities Research Council, with the British Academy and the Wellcome Trust. There are over 300 events, in fact, in the 10 days of the festival. And that is, in fact, a festival which began in last week on Thursday, and it will last for about 10 days, something like that. And there are events in universities, galleries, museums, cultural organisations, and so we're delighted that the UK NZ Link has become part of this celebration, really, of the humanities in all its many varieties. I'm also delighted that Dr. Jenny Macleod is giving the second of the lectures. Jenny is well known to military historians in Britain. She teaches at present at the University of Hull, but she's a graduate of Edinburgh University and of Cambridge as well, where she did her PhD. And she's been a lecturer in modern British history the University of Newcastle, King's College London, and also at the Defence Studies Unit in the Joint Services Command and Staff College. And in that period she has built up a formidable reputation as a historian of the First World War, but in particular of commemoration and national identity in 20th century warfare. And her latest book, which is outside Gallipoli, was published earlier this year by Oxford University Press, and it's on the military but also the cultural history and the memory of the Gallipoli campaign. And it's in fact the first book to compare the memory of the campaign in all the combatant nations, Australia and New Zealand of course, but also Britain, Ireland and indeed Turkey. So we're looking forward very much to Jenny Macleod, Remembering Gallipoli in New Zealand and beyond. Jenny.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you to the NZ UK Link Foundation for inviting me to be here tonight. At the end of this week, Referendum 1 on a possible new flag for New Zealand will open. The task will be to choose between 5 possible designs. The preferred design will then be considered against the current flag in a second referendum in March 2016. In drawing up its shortlist, the panel that sifted through 10,000 suggested alternative flag designs drew up a number of criteria, which include, these of course are the 5 alternatives and the original flag. The criteria included the following. The flag should unmistakably be from New Zealand and celebrate us as a progressive, inclusive nation that is connected to its environment and has a sense of its past and a vision for its future. It should be a great flag that has an enduring quality which will not become outdated and will work well in all situations from celebration to commemoration. And the flag should be inclusive in that all New Zealanders should be able to see themselves within it. It's a central premise of the flag consideration project that the existing flag may no longer pass this test. With its Union Jack in the corner, it speaks to the country's strong historic links with the UK, but does not reflect its multicultural present. In particular, it is not inclusive of Aotearoa New Zealand's proud Maori heritage. Nor is the present New Zealand ensign unmistakably from New Zealand, given its strong similarity to Australia's flag. Nonetheless, it remains a powerful symbol on commemorative occasions, and one of the strongest lines of criticism of the mooted change has been that New Zealanders have fought and died under the current flag for more than a century. The question underpinning these flag referenda is, what do we stand for? The question was posed to the New Zealand people, and a huge number of responses were submitted, including this from Stacey. I stand for not wasting millions on a new flipping flag. I'd like to reflect on the question, what do we stand for, in a different way, by reflecting on some aspects of the commemoration of Gallipoli in New Zealand. On the New Zealand Battlefield Memorial at Chunuk Bair, there is the inscription, "From the uttermost ends of the earth." Tonight, I wish to place New Zealand's commemoration not at the periphery, but at the centre. Too often, the NZ in Anzac has been silent. The analysis of Australia's memory of the campaign has been assumed to stand for 2 countries, not just one. So, taking some cues from those criteria for a new flag, I'm going to explore what has been unmistakably characteristic of New Zealand in its commemoration, but also how it's come to pass that it has been confused with or overwhelmed by Australia's concerns. I'm going to look at the resonance of the Union Jack in the corner of the flag by tracing something of the sense of Britishness and how long it survived in the rhetoric of commemoration before becoming outdated. And I'm also going to touch on how commemoration has become more inclusive to better reflect an experience and a meaning that all New Zealanders should be able to see themselves within. But first, a reminder of the role New Zealand forces play at Gallipoli. The New Zealanders who fought at Gallipoli were all volunteers. Commanded by the British General Sir Alexander Godley, they formed part of the New Zealand and Australia Division, the second division of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. About 3,000 New Zealanders landed at what became known as Anzac Cove on the 25th of April 1915. They formed the second wave of the invading forces and landed from around 9 AM onwards. Perhaps 20% of them became casualties that day. The New Zealand forces saw action in both sectors of the peninsula, at Cape Helles as well as the Anzac sector during the campaign, and they were reinforced from home by the dismounted New Zealand Mounted Rifles Brigade a couple of weeks after the landings, and then by the New Zealand Maori contingent in early July. The Maori contingent was just in time to take part in a major renewed effort in the campaign. In August, a breakout from the Anzac sector was attempted. In the difficult terrain of Gallipoli, it was vital to gain the three high points of the Sari-Bear Ridge that dominated the sector. They were Kojutemen-Chementepe, Hillkew, and Chunuk Bair. During the offensive, the Gurkhas briefly captured Hillkew, and it fell to New Zealand forces to attack and hold Chunuk Bair. The man who led them was Lieutenant General William Malone. His Wellington battalion, with support from other British and New Zealand battalions, held the summit, or ground just below it, between the 8th and the 10th of August. Whilst they did so, they gained a brief view of the narrows of the Dardanelles on the other side of the peninsula. It was a beguiling sight that must have made victory seem within their grasp. During the battle, Malone and many of his men were killed. The Ottomans also suffered important losses, and in the reorganisation of their command structure that took place as battle raged, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Kemal was put in charge of the area. Some hours after the exhausted New Zealand forces were relieved by an inexperienced new army battalion, the Lancashires, Kemal struck the decisive blow. He personally crept forward to launch 16 battalions into the attack and succeeded in sweeping the British and New Zealanders from their toeholds on the Sari-Bear Ridge. Chunuk Bair is known in Turkey to this day as Kemal-Yeri, Kemal's place. Although it was not immediately apparent, the loss of Chunuk Bair marked the failure of the August offensive. The failure of the August offensive signalled the failure of the Gallipoli campaign. 5 months later, the peninsula was evacuated. It's difficult to say how many New Zealanders served at Gallipoli, but we know that 2,700 of them died at Gallipoli, including 50 Maori. The first commemorations of the New Zealanders' service and losses at Gallipoli took place on the first anniversaries of the landings on the 25th of April 1916. They were held here in London and across New Zealand. In reflecting on these commemorations and how they evolved during the 1920s and 30s, I want to concentrate to begin with on those aspects that were unmistakably from New Zealand. And drawing on material from my book and developing on insights from my fellowship at the University of Canterbury earlier this year, and on the work of New Zealand scholars, particularly that of Margaret Harris, I will argue that many of the activities on Anzac Day were shared with Australia, but the tone, the emphasis, and the meanings attributed to them were distinctive. In towns and cities across New Zealand, there were marches of returned men and services of remembrance, and we can trace what was said at them and what was written about them through the extensive available newspaper coverage, in editorials, and through the reported sermons, prayers, and speeches. Indeed, churches and religious or spiritual sentiment in general figured much more prominently in New Zealand's Anzac Day than they did in Australia, where similar events were also held across the country. Anzac Day 1916 was a newly minted tradition, which drew upon the established format of a military funeral. Its hymns, prayers, and benediction will have had a comforting familiarity and a consoling message of sacrifice and redemption. It also reflects the importance of the church within New Zealand, that the difficulty of agreeing on combined ecumenical services was a particularly vexed feature in the preparations for the day. Arguments and resignations occurred across the country as clergymen attempted to adhere to their church's rules, whilst commemorative committees and returned men sought to recreate the unified arrangements they had had at the front. The fervent religiosity of early 20th century New Zealand also shaped the meanings ascribed to Gallipoli. Commentators there appear to have conceived of Gallipoli as a spiritual rather than a military test. Thus, whilst criticisms of the failed campaign were met in Australia by assertions of their soldiers' heroism, in New Zealand they were just as likely to emphasise their spiritual achievements. For example, in its Anzac Day editorial in 1920, the newspaper The Northern Advocate found meaning in the sacrifice at Gallipoli that far outweighed the reality of defeat. It wrote, "The remembrance of the free sacrifice of all that life counts dear, and the meditation on such heroism is a moral and spiritual tonic. That the full result of the military objective was not attained is a minor matter when compared with the spiritual objective, which was as much higher than the material as the sky is above the earth." Well into the 1920s, the spirit of sacrifice was held up as an inspiration to present-day action. As Reverend Fielding Taylor put it in 1925, the call of Anzac is the call to service. There was also a particularly intense insistence that the day was sacred, and thus sporting or commercial activities were inappropriate to the solemnity of the day. Horse races were cancelled, hotels were closed during the day, and picture theatres didn't open until after the memorial services had been completed. The sombre tone of the day, established in 1916, survived for years. It was enshrined in law that Anzac Day should be treated as a Sunday, and it was sometimes claimed to be on a par with the sacred nature of Good Friday. The Returned Soldiers Association was instrumental in this process of reinforcing Anzac Day as a day of mourning. And interestingly, although returned soldiers proved deeply influential on the nature of commemoration in both New Zealand and Australia, their influence pushed in opposite directions. Where New Zealand returned men pushed for greater solemnity, Australian returned men encouraged an element of celebration to be introduced into the day. It followed, therefore, that in New Zealand any commercial activity on Anzac Day was roundly condemned. Indeed, the enforced Sabbatarianism of the day led a man to be prosecuted in 1927 for his behaviour on Anzac Day. His alleged crime? He'd been seen hoeing his turnips. He was acquitted, but probably only because he was passing time until he headed to an Anzac Day service and his son had fought in the war. It actually reached the point in New Zealand that the Governor-General stepped in and suggested in 1929 that Anzac Day was too mournful. As one columnist in the Auckland Star had commented, to the teeming millions at home, such an occasion as Anzac Day would ask, should a country spend a whole day in mourning, and why should a mantle of gloom be permitted to envelop its inhabitants from dawn till dark? The dead of the old country are not forgotten. Armistice Day is observed with unfailing reverence and poignancy. But after the Great Silence, the heart of the Empire beats as vigorously, nay, as gaily as ever, and the rest of the day is one of rejoicing. Surely it is some strong strain of self-repression drawn from a stern and Puritan ancestry which impels New Zealand to honour her valiant dead by a day of tears and woe. During the 1930s, as the tradition became more well established and the immediacy of grief reduced, some of the gloomier aspects of the day were relinquished. And we can see here a further example of how New Zealand reflexively looked to Britain for a lead. In Britain, the funeral of George V in 1936 was marked by 2 minutes silence rather than a day of mourning. In that context, New Zealand's Anzac Day began to look out of step with commemorative traditions elsewhere. Thus, the first characteristic of commemoration that was unmistakably from and of New Zealand was its religious doerness. Now, it's sometimes been asserted that the sorrowful tone of New Zealand's commemoration of Gallipoli and the war reflects the unusual scale of its loss. This idea is to be found in the otherwise fantastic exhibition about Gallipoli at the Te Papa Museum in Wellington that's on currently. Built around 8 extraordinary oversized sculptures of New Zealanders who were at Gallipoli, the exhibition tells the story of the country's participation in the campaign. It's a powerful, moving and informative exhibition, but in one important regard I think it's also misleading. At the end of the exhibition, it sets out the casualty statistics for all the participant nations. Expressed in terms of the numbers of men who were killed and wounded, they tell a terrible story of sacrifice and loss. But expressed as a percentage of men who served in the campaign, they become problematic. It's stated at Te Papa that 93% of New Zealanders became casualties at Gallipoli, but that only 50% of the Australians who served there did so. Now don't get me wrong, even the small of those figures is dreadful. But that 93% figure I think is almost certainly wrong. It's notoriously difficult to establish precise statistics for the fallen. And oddly, it's even more difficult to establish how many men served in total. The Tate Backer exhibition draws on the figure in Fred Waite's official history of New Zealanders at Gallipoli. This slim volume very probably underestimated the numbers who served by simply replicating a miscalculated statistic from the Commander-in-Chief, General Sir Ian Hamilton. A more recent calculation by Richard Stowers gives a significantly higher number for the men who served, and thereby reduces the casualty rate to 53%. And this seems more likely to me. The New Zealand forces were not given significantly different tasks at Gallipoli to the Australians, and it seems reasonable to expect a roughly similar casualty rate. To exaggerate such a figure holds the potential to profoundly alter the public understanding of Gallipoli from one that is of a shared part in a tragically botched campaign to one of victimhood. And I don't believe that such a deeply political idea was the aim of this exhibition. Now, let us return to what was unmistakably characteristic of New Zealand in the country's commemoration of the campaign. Along with the religious idea of sacrifice, the most important theme in the editorials and sermons of the early Anzac days was New Zealand's proud role within the empire. The Union Jack in the corner of the flag was truly meaningful to them. As the Otago Daily Times' editorial put it in 1916, Anzac Day symbolises, as it were, that new unity of the British Empire which the war has brought into being. Far from the experience of Gallipoli heralding a new sense of nationhood for New Zealanders, it appears to have engendered a deeper sense of the bonds of empire. The Evening Post, on the eve of Anzac Day, argued that heroes of those new countries added lustre to that world-honoured name, British. Such was the commitment to empire and the even-handed instincts of New Zealanders that some amongst them felt uncomfortable with the exaggeration of their role that was developing through the use of the word Anzac. In order to better acknowledge the role of the British at Gallipoli, one New Zealand MP even proposed altering the acronym to Banzac, and the idea didn't catch on clearly. The same point cannot really be said of Australia. Although Australians also viewed their achievements within the context of empire in the war years, there always seems to have been a greater readiness to proclaim their special qualities. As one recruiting sergeant put it in 1917, it was Anzac Day, terrible and glorious, that proved the Australian to be worthy of the first rank among the fighters of the world, men at once brave, tenacious of purpose, strong in execution, and rich in imagination. Indeed, Australians readily latched on to the message propounded by their official war correspondent and official historian Charles Bean, the message that the Australian soldiers exemplified particular qualities, the best qualities of their nation. And this idea has always been at the heart of Australia's Anzac Day. Both New Zealand and Australia shared common elements of British imperial culture. Amongst these was the shared idea that nations are born in war. Another revolves around race and the idea that men of fine British stock might develop further strengths when transplanted to the New World. This kind of thinking informed Bean's work, and it was certainly not unknown in New Zealand. Take this extract from Ormond Burton's 1935 book, The Silent Division. He wrote, "It needed only some catastrophe, some great suffering born together, some great deed done in common to make the New Zealanders conscious of their identity as a nation. Such a deed and such suffering they found on the slopes of Sari Bair. When the August fighting died down, there was no longer any question but that the New Zealanders had commenced to realise themselves as a nation. The process was not complete, but it was well begun." Now, Ormond continues to explain that in comparison to the English, our men were taller and stronger, deeper chested, better muscled, capable of greater and more prolonged physical effort. Their general standard of intelligence was much higher. Englishmen and New Zealanders were of one blood, had grown up in a similar climate, but New Zealanders were better fed, better housed, and had led more of their lives outdoors and had played more sport in a society where class distinctions were slight. Now, by way of comparison, here's an extract from Bean's official history. The Australian became a race whose tradition was one of independence and enterprise, and within that race itself from a stock more adventurous and for the most part physically more strong than the general run of men. By reason of open-air life in the new climate and of greater abundance of food, the people developed more fully the large frames which seemed normal to Anglo-Saxons living under generous conditions. An active life, as well as the climate, rendered the body wiry and the face lean, easily lined and thin-lipped. I've no idea how climate affects your lips. The two extracts then are nearly interchangeable, but Beans chimed with his country's sentiments, and the man himself was instrumental in a great nation-building project. Whereas the New Zealander Burton's take on the significance of his country's Anzacs remained a minority view that did not inform the commemoration of Gallipoli. So a further unmistakable characteristic of New Zealand commemoration was not just the continuing allegiance to Britain, but its flip side, an absence of nationalism. So what is there in the two countries that explains this difference? If we continue with the theory that nations are born in war, we could look to the Boer War. Soldiers from Australia fought there as representatives of different states, whereas New Zealand was already well established when its men fought in South Africa. Yet although it's been argued that they did develop a sense of identity from the experience, this doesn't seem to have set in train a particular national tradition. Similarly, I don't have a sense of a national identity flowing from the New Zealand wars, and certainly that's not the case with Australia and its frontier wars, or else the Australian War Memorial would not continue its disgraceful policy of not acknowledging this internal violence against Indigenous Australians within its precincts. Differences between earlier experiences of war don't seem to help to solve the conundrum of why First World War era Australia was ready to forge a nation-building story from Gallipoli and New Zealand was not. So this makes me wonder a few things. Perhaps I'm asking the wrong question by assuming that for New Zealand, war, commemoration and national identity are inevitably linked. Perhaps I'm looking in the wrong place. Perhaps New Zealand drew its identity from its 19th century history, from the Treaty of Waitangi, its progressive gender politics or its sport, and it simply didn't need to use Anzac Day for this nation-building purpose. Whereas Australia, despite its peaceful creation through federation and its claim to be a working man's paradise, may have been able to overlook its treatment of its Indigenous people, but couldn't quite shake off a concern that their racial stock had been tainted by the convict stain. Or perhaps I'm employing the wrong time frame by looking for nationalism too early in New Zealand. And I think I probably am. Perhaps then, another unmistakable New Zealand characteristic of its commemoration was the slower speed with which it proceeded towards espousing nationalism through Anzac Day. And this, in part, I think, has to do with institutions and personalities. I think that the business of who writes about history and how they do it has a significant impact on how a nation views its past. This is why I view Charles Bean as such an important figure in Australia, and the absence of an equivalent to him is so significant for New Zealand. It's both a symptom of the absence of New Zealand nationalism and a cause of it. In the first instance, Charles Bean was an official war correspondent accompanying the AIF in the war, whilst New Zealand appointed Malcolm Ross to an equivalent role. However, dithering by the authorities at home delayed Ross's arrival on the peninsula such that he missed the landings. They then compounded the error by being too stingy to pay for Ross to cable his reports home. By the time his dispatches arrived by post in New Zealand, they were out of date. Ross was also supposed to collect artefacts from a museum and to write an official history of the war. But Ross was not cut from the same cloth as Bean, and key figures in Wellington stood in his way, and the outcomes in each country were therefore very different. Bean edited a 12-volume official history of Australia's First World War, whereas New Zealand's histories of the war were slim volumes for popular consumption with no greater ambition. That extract that I discussed earlier by Ormond Burton followed on from his work writing the official history of the Auckland Infantry Regiment. He may have perceived the Anzacs in a similar light to Bean, but his overall purpose in life was very different. As a pacifist, his goal was to work towards a fairer and more socialist society, not to develop a new national tradition based on the war experience as Bean had sought in Australia. Bean was also instrumental in founding the Australian War Memorial. Communities across New Zealand, of course, erected their own memorials, but there was no equivalent government-sponsored project. The government-funded National War Memorial lapsed in the 1920s and was revived only by private subscriptions. Nor was the National Memorial accompanied by a museum as in Canberra. Perhaps the Auckland War Memorial Museum, which opened in 1929, is the closest equivalent to the Australian War Memorial. It does seem characteristic, though, of New Zealand's emphasis on the sacred nature of commemoration, rather than the didactic purpose of a museum, that there was a degree of controversy as to whether the building was sufficiently sacred, and a cenotaph and court of honour were added to the initial design. I also think it's telling of the separation of commemoration and nationalism in New Zealand that the National Army Museum was only opened in Wairaruru in 1978, and that a separate National Museum in Te Papa, decidedly not a war museum, opened only in 1992. For decades, there was no desire or effort made in New Zealand to institutionalise and thereby sustain and foster the memory of war. The commemoration of Anzac Day has therefore carried a nationalist charge in Australia that has been largely absent in New Zealand. Australia used Anzac Day to steadily differentiate itself from Britain, whereas New Zealand felt comfortable with its Britishness for far longer. It was not truly shaken until after the Second World War, when New Zealand's close ties with Britain were deeply damaged by the end of unfettered access for its goods and people once Britain joined the common market. Later, changing immigration patterns in the 80s and 90s made New Zealand more ethnically diverse and less British. Thus, until fairly recently, the Union Jack of New Zealand's flag has spoken powerfully both to a sense of its past, and a dominant portion of its inhabitants have seen themselves within it. Now, probably the most striking example of the end of Britishness in Remembering Gallipoli in New Zealand is the 1982 play Once on Chinook Bay. In its place, playwright Maurice Shadbolt espoused an unusually aggressive New Zealand nationalism. The play not only asserted the pivotal nature of the August events of Gallipoli and of the capture of Chinook Bay within it, but contained enough pom-bashing comments to suggest to the audience that the Brits had let the valiant Kiwis down. The play was not immediately popular, and the 1991 film version was artistically disappointing. Therefore, Once on Chinook Bay didn't reach a wider audience or leave a lasting legacy in the way that its equivalent, Peter Weir's film Gallipoli, did for Australia. So what I've been arguing is that there are certain aspects of New Zealand's commemoration of Gallipoli that are unmistakably characteristic of the country. The greater emphasis on sacrifice and on mourning the dead, the greater readiness to perceive the campaign's significance in terms of the empire and an absence of nationalism, and following on from that, the absence of a nation-building project through commemoration. Now, if we fast forward to the 21st century, what we see is the slow-burning emergence of a New Zealand nationalism in war commemoration that has borrowed tactics from Australia, but has deployed them in an unmistakably New Zealand way. From 1990 onwards, Australian governments have made a concerted effort to develop Anzac Day. Bob Hawke's government lavishly funded the commemoration of the 75th anniversary at Anzac Cove. In his speech at the dawn service, Hawke drew on Bean and the sentiments of the Gettysburg Address to renew a sense of the location as a sacred site for Australians. New Zealand sent its Governor-General to the occasion. And instead, in 1990, it was probably the 150th anniversary of the Treaty of Waitangi that was the more prominent occasion in New Zealand. It was a decade later that New Zealand embraced the symbolism, and its own Prime Minister attended the dawn service on the peninsula. That was Helen Clark, and under her leadership, New Zealand started to make the kind of investment in the country's military heritage that Australia was already doing. Like her Australian counterpart, John Howard, she shared a personal link to the war. 10 of her great-uncles had fought in the First World War, and one of them had died at Gallipoli. She significantly increased funding for culture during her time in office, recognising the potential to encourage the expression of the nation's identity therein. In this period, new war memorials were unveiled around the world, and she often attended commemorative services overseas, thereby underlining their importance through her office. Most prominent of these initiatives was the interment of a New Zealand unknown warrior in Wellington in 2004, an event attended by perhaps 100,000 people. And yet, even then, the full-throttle nationalism of Anzac in Australia was absent. If you compare the commemorative speeches of the country's prime ministers, in place of the soaring rhetoric of Hawke or Keating on such occasions, Clarke made more prosaic yet heartfelt statements of New Zealand's identity. The sentiments that concluded her speech at the interment of the unknown warrior seem to me to capture key aspects that are unmistakably New Zealand. There are no bombastic statements of distinctive qualities, but instead an overriding sorrow at the loss in war. Instead of the place in the world achieved through empire, there's now an emphasis on internationalism through peacekeeping. So Helen Clarke said this: "The tomb of the unknown warrior symbolises of the very personal tragedies New Zealanders have endured in our engagement with wars overseas. Let it also be a testimony of pride in New Zealand's contribution, a reminder of the heroism of our people, and a symbol of our ongoing commitment to a more harmonious and peaceful world." In Australia, Gallipoli has been an alternative to dealing with its troubled relations with Aboriginal Australians. The 1990 extravaganza came hard on the heels of the difficult bicentenary of the arrival of the First Fleet. John Howard, the Prime Minister keenest on promoting Anzac, was also the most vehement in rejecting what he termed the black armband view of history that attempted to grapple with Australia's history of dispossession. By contrast, New Zealand, which itself has sometimes struggled over the meaning and commemoration of Waitangi, has ultimately been the more successful in reflecting both Pakeha and Māori in its recent commemorations of Gallipoli. None more so than at the centenary of the fighting at Chinook Bay this August. It is not just that elements of Māori culture were incorporated in the ceremony as some kind of window dressing, they were absolutely fundamental to it. From the ceremonial beginnings to the proceedings, the extensive use of Māori greetings, the clothing worn by the New Zealand ambassador to Turkey, the singing of Waiata, that's Māori songs, and the New Zealand national anthem as ever sung in both languages. Māori elements were part and parcel of the proceedings as much as the familiar elements of military commemorations of British heritage, the Lord's Prayer, Lawrence Binnion's Ode for the Fallen, a bugler sounding the last post following the silence, and a piper playing a lament. At the end of the service, then, most stirringly, there was the performance by members of the New Zealand Defence Force, men and women, Māori and Pakeha, of a haka dedicated to all soldiers of all nationalities who fought and died at Gallipoli. And then afterwards, as the military band played Elgar's Nimrod, New Zealand's most recent VC winner, Corporal Willie Apiata, VC, greeted the haka party with a traditional homi, pressing his nose and forehead to each of them in turn. Now, hopefully if this works, I can play you that haka. So that really moving moment's complete. By the wonders of YouTube. Right. Thus was commemorated the centenary of the first time Pakeha and Maori New Zealanders fought together in Europe. A powerful and deeply moving ceremony that unmistakably came from New Zealand. I've argued elsewhere that Anzac Day is Australia's greatest export, and it's certainly true that important aspects of the day's format, not least the dawn service, are Australian in origin and specific to their role in the campaign. But when you look closely at the detail from a New Zealand point of view, it can nonetheless be argued that there are elements that are unmistakably characteristic of New Zealand. The emphasis on sacrifice and the mournful tone, the lingering strength of the British connection, and the absence of nationalism for many years. Thus, like the flags of the two countries, there are strong similarities, but in detail they are different. On Anzac Day overseas, the crowds may merge, but when they separate as at Chinook Bear this year, they undoubtedly show that enduring elements of commemoration can be updated for a bicultural nation so that all New Zealanders may see themselves without losing a sense of its past. Thank you.